Lisa, my wife, and I have done the best we can to encourage our kids to be bold about their faith. But sometimes when they are, I question what we've done. I remember one time when my daughter Chloe first started playing soccer. She was about 4 years old. It was her very first practice, and the coach has all the girls sit down in a circle to get to know each other better. And no sooner had they sat on the grass when my daughter blurts out, "Okay, so who here's a Christian?" Yeah. Today we wrap up this series, A Questionable Life. And while we're all at different places on our spiritual journeys, I know we all have this in common. We want our lives to matter. We want to make a difference. We want to live the kind of life that makes people wonder. Now, I love how bold Chloe was when she was little, but that may not be the best way for us as adults to cause people to wonder. Today, we're talking about living the kind of life where people reflect on why you act the way you do, because it's not what is expected. It's not easy or typical. Chances are we all know someone like this. The person who goes out of their way to do good for others. The person who lives simply and is incredibly generous. The person who forgives endlessly and inspires others to do the same. These people live questionable lives. Jesus lived that kind of life. How he lived was so interesting that people often asked, "Who are you really? Why do you do what you do?" People questioned everything from him, from what he did to what he said to who he hung out with. Jesus was often at odds with the religious leaders of his time because of that. In his day, the cultural expectation or norm was to be religious. You actually gained influence and clout if you were perceived to be really good at following Old Testament law. Now, the Pharisees, they were the best at keeping these laws, so they took great effort to ensure that everyone knew they followed the letter of the law. Now, to be clear, there was nothing wrong with actually following Old Testament law. God expected it. But the conflicts developed between Jesus and the Pharisees when they, twisted the law, trying to force people into this weary cycle of living up to certain standards in order to earn God's acceptance. In the book of Matthew, we read about an incident where the Pharisees accuse Jesus' closest followers of not living up to the cultural norm. And while Jesus couldn't care less about cultural norms or religious piety, he took them to task because he was interested in perpetuating the heart and intent behind God's actual commands. Well, things heat up pretty quickly between Jesus and the Pharisees, and this is how it reads in the Message version. Pharisees and religion scholars came to Jesus all the way from Jerusalem, criticizing, "Why do your disciples play fast and loose with the rules?" But Jesus put it right back on them. "Why do you use your rules to play fast and loose with God's commands?" Jesus doesn't mix words. He goes right after these so-called religious leaders. Quoting from the prophet Isaiah, he says, "These people make a big show of saying the right thing, but their heart isn't in it. They act like they're worshiping me, but they don't mean it. They just use me as a cover for teaching whatever suits their fancy." You see, the one thing Jesus couldn't stand almost more than anything else were fakes, frauds. People who claimed to be followers of the one true God, but were really only interested in keeping step with religious culture and protecting their own reputations. You see, you'll never find Jesus taking someone to task for their wrongdoings and messed upness when they come to him with a humble heart, seeking forgiveness and a chance to start over. But the prideful, arrogant, the so-called religious elite, he had no time for their games. Well, Jesus continues by painting this rather graphic picture. He says, "Don't you know that anything that is swallowed works its way through the intestines and is finally defecated? But what comes out of the mouth gets its start in the heart. It's from the heart that we vomit up evil arguments, murders, adulteries, fornications, theft, lies, and cussing. That's what pollutes. Eating or not eating certain foods, washing or not washing your hands, that's neither here nor there." So what is Jesus getting at with all this imagery of stuff entering our body and passing through as opposed to stuff that originates in our hearts and flows out? And what does this have to do with living a questionable life? Well, first, Jesus is saying you can't fake your way into living a questionable life. You just can't. Jesus wanted nothing to do with pretenders. You see, he loved to spend time with imperfect people, tax collectors, prostitutes, people who didn't have their act together. but wanted to get closer to him. Living a questionable life is not about pretending to be someone you're not and living up to some sort of behavioral expectations. Second thing Jesus is saying is this: what matters is your heart. He says that what comes out of the mouth gets its start in the heart. And then he mentions all sorts of bad stuff: arguments, adultery, thefts, lies, stuff we see on the outside that actually comes from the inside, the heart. And he goes on to say, you can obey all the rules you want. You can strive to do all sorts of good, but if your heart isn't right, it really means nothing. So if you really want to live a questionable life, it's got to start from the inside out. It's got to start in the heart. Years ago, Christian psychiatrist Frank Lake and a theologian named Emil Brunner noticed a pattern in Jesus' life. Grace always seemed to flow into him, and then that grace flowed out of him into others. I think this pattern had a lot to do with how Jesus lived a questionable life and why his actions were always consistent with his convictions. Lake and Brunner called this pattern the cycle of grace. I'd like to walk you through that right now. Here's what the cycle looked like, okay? The first move in the cycle of grace is acceptance. Jesus' first public act was to get baptized by John the Baptist. When he comes out of the water, the Father spoke to him from heaven and says, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." He's saying, you're my son. That's who you are. I love you. That's how I feel about you. That is your identity. That is your value. That is your worth. This right here is the beginning of the cycle of grace. John Ortberg, pastor and author, says, identity and acceptance come before achievement and work. Identity and acceptance come before achievement and ministry. In other words, achievement is not done to demonstrate identity. You see, the religious leaders of Jesus' day told people, here are all the behaviors you need to do in order to be accepted. But Jesus would have nothing to do with that. Acceptance starts in the heart. There's nothing we can do to earn this. There's nothing we can do that can have that taken away from us. Acceptance isn't based on our behavior. It is based on God's unconditional love for us. I'll tell you what, think about a newborn baby, okay? I mean, most people love little babies, right? There are few things we celebrate like we do the day a baby is born. And then think about it, every year after that, we continue to celebrate that day. But the truth is, there's nothing more helpless, weaker, slower, dumber, uncoordinated, or more incompetent than a newborn baby. I might get myself a little bit in trouble here, but the truth is, they're not even that cute when they're first born. Except for my own, of course. Even so, there is nothing more treasured and accepted than a newborn baby. I mean, that baby is absolutely loved from the moment it is born, and we celebrate that day simply because this baby exists. No other reason. Every human being, from the moment they are born, has worth. That is called grace. You see, you and I are loved. We are accepted. Living a questionable life has got to start right here, in the heart, with acceptance. That's the first move. So the second move then in the cycle of grace is sustenance, or sustaining grace. What we see in Jesus' life is not only did he understand that God accepted him, he also chose to live in that acceptance every single day. And he had practices that he engaged in to help him experience God's grace and replenish his soul. He would pray. He connected with a close circle of friends. He engaged in worship with others. He knew the scriptures. He would go off on long walks by himself. And he would experience God in nature. All practices that sustained him. Now see, I think sometimes we see these practices as behaviors that we're supposed to do to prove that we are spiritual. But see, that's what the Pharisees were doing. They didn't engage in religious practices and behaviors to experience God's grace. They did them to impress others and to prove themselves worthy to God. Have you ever tried that? Have you ever tried to engage in spiritual practices to prove something to others, yourself, or to God? I mean, it's exhausting, isn't it? That's not how Jesus lived. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anybody. He used these sustaining practices to live in his Father's grace and to replenish his soul. When Jesus was baptized, the voice of God said to him, you are my son. And right after that, he is led into the desert where the evil one tempts Jesus, saying, if you're the Son of God, tell these stones. Or if you're the Son of God, throw yourself down. In other words, don't trust the voice of God telling you you're accepted. Don't trust grace. You got to prove it. But doesn't that sound familiar? I mean, do you ever have those times where you think you're beginning to kind of grasp God's love and grace, only to have those moments dashed by feelings of insecurity and doubt where you begin again to think you have to prove your worth to God? See, Jesus sustained himself in God's grace and responds to the evil one, the accuser, by letting God speak to him to squelch the lies that swirled around him. And if Jesus needed those practices to sustain him, how much more do we? All right, so we start with acceptance. We move to sustenance. Then the next move in the cycle of grace is significance. And I believe this is all about the idea that deep down we want to live a questionable life. Like I said earlier, we want our lives to make a difference. And you see, as God's grace flows into us and we have practices that sustain that grace, we can begin to let that grace flow out from us to others. We see this in Jesus' life over and over again. He knew who he was. His identity was grounded in the love and grace of his Father. But he also knew his identity had significance. He was who he was because there were purposes for him to fulfill. He even made statements like, I am the way, to show you how to find your way back to God. I am the vine, to sustain you and empower you with life. I am the good shepherd, to watch over and care for you. You see, Jesus was grounded in the knowledge of who he was, and he was sustained by the grace of God. And he poured that grace into the lives of others. And in the same way, we are made to make a difference, to bring God's grace to the people and places we come across every day. My wife, Lisa, her 9-to-5 job is to be a math coach for the Chicago Public Schools. And she loves her job. But her true role is to encourage the teachers who are under-resourced and in desperate need of help and support. My friend Craig is a successful businessman, but his real role is to be a radically generous giver. He gives money, opens his home, sets aside all sorts of time to connect with other guys, all because he wants more people to find their way back to God. Every one of us was made for significance, to live a questionable life. And then the final move in that cycle of grace is achievement. This is action. This is your life producing something. And Jesus did a lot of this. He taught, he recruited, he healed, he challenged, he cast vision. And to say that the world is a different place because of it would be a monumental understatement. Jesus achieved more than any other human being. And he did it from grace. And he knew it's got to start in the heart. And because it started there, it filled him up. In fact, he once said, "My food is to do the will of my Father." You see, achieving God's plan for his life this way, it actually filled Jesus up. And that's what it can do for us. That is the cycle of grace. But the religious leaders in Jesus' day, and so many of us, we follow a different cycle, don't we? You might call it the cycle of works. It's not an inside-out strategy, no. It doesn't start with the heart. It's more of an outside-in strategy. Take a look at the cycle of works. It's the same 4 steps as the cycle of grace, but what do? We go in the opposite direction. We achieve, we do stuff, usually good stuff, even religious stuff, to show people and ourselves that we are significant and important. And then we hope that this significance sustains us through the challenges and disappointments of life, because it's all a desperate effort to fulfill our deep longing for, that's right, acceptance. Do you see how we get this whole thing turned around? Another name for this cycle of works could be the cycle of religion, or the cycle of Wall Street, or the Board of Trade, or the cycle of Silicon Valley or Hollywood, or the cycle of every sports field across America. Because in these places, you see, achievement is the highest goal, and we sacrifice anything and everything to make it. God is calling us to a questionable and countercultural way of life that rejects the cycle of works. And do you see how Jesus' life, screamed back to the religious leaders of his day, it's not the outside that matters. If the inside is right, the outside will take care of itself. It's got to start in the heart. Some friends of ours at Community, Patrick and Nancy, they know this really well. Here's their story.
My name is Patrick O'Connell. It's my wife, Nancy. We've been married 22 years. We have 3 kids, Bailey, Declan, and Cormac. We met when we were 16 in a punk rock mosh pit, and we've really been together ever since. We started dating literally that night. There was no real spiritual influence in my life.
I did not really have a relationship with God at the time when we first got married.
And so after I got out of the Army, a friend of mine got me a job interview at a very prestigious money management firm. Had a little bit of background in it, so I took the job because we had a daughter at the time. And I was soon pursuing the corporate dream of what's the next title, what's the next raise, what's the next milestone that I can achieve in the corporate world. But if I'm honest, I was a cruddy dad, absent in my marriage in a lot of ways. I know I wasn't living up to the person I knew I could be. This is really what my life's going to be about, the next promotion, the next pay bump. Is that enough for me? And I think I became really honest with myself, and I realized it wasn't.
We moved into a neighborhood in Plainfield and met some neighbors. One of them who attended just kept asking me to come to church with her, and I just wanted her to stop. So I actually went with her one Sunday, and the video was on forgiveness. And I had some issues with some family members that I could not forgive. I could feel the weight being lifted off of my shoulders. It was a pretty amazing experience for me.
I began to see the way she treated me was different, and she had more grace and patience for me, and in hindsight, I see now that she was beginning to evolve spiritually and grow spiritually, and I wasn't.
Patrick was in a dark place, I think, the year before he actually came to Community. So that was scary for me because I knew that he was struggling.
The best way I can describe it is I came into a season where I was open. I actually started reading the Gospels and moving through those and getting more familiar with who Jesus was and what he actually said. I knew she had found something, and I trusted her enough and had enough faith and confidence in what she was going through to know that there was something legitimate here. For whatever reason, I was ready at that point in my life to follow that Jesus, and that's the one I've been following ever since.
I remember being at a celebration service where they were sending out a church planter to plant a church in Colorado, and that some of the people that were there during the services would quit their jobs and up and leave and help plant this church. And I thought, who would do that? That's crazy. That's a crazy idea. Who would do that? Well, we would. A few years later, Patrick left his business, and we sold our house in Plainfield and moved to Kansas City to plant a church with a few other families from Community.
I was really having a blast in Kansas City, planting churches and being with friends. But then, as God often does, he called us to the next season. We were able to come back to Chicago, and I now have this great privilege and honor to work with a great team of people to help plant churches all over the world so people can find their way back to God. That has taken me to Ecuador, to Africa.
Following Jesus has blown the roof off of everything that I thought life would be. I never dreamed that it would be what it is today.
It's just been an amazing journey, and I'm so glad that I said yes to that call that Jesus made on my life.
So let me ask you, in which cycle do you want to live? You see, we can stay on that all too familiar cycle of works where we achieve defined significance in hopes that somehow that will sustain us and ultimately bring acceptance. We all know that it only lasts as long as your last promotion, your most recent compliment, or your most significant victory, and then you start all over again. All right, so here's some good news. Today, you can step off the tired cycle of works and begin to live a questionable life in the cycle of grace. But here's the most important question you will ever answer. Are you ready? Have you said yes to Jesus? Have you ever said yes to the one who wants to free you from your past, give you a purpose for your present, and a hope for your future? You see, he wants to give you a questionable life. And if you have said yes to following him, then you are forgiven. You are a child of God. Just like the cycle of grace shows us, it begins with acceptance, not because of what I've done, but because of what Christ has already done for us. Brennan Manning, who wrote Ragamuffin Gospel, was a former priest and a recovering alcoholic who once said, "God loves us as we are and not as we should be, because none of us are as we should be." And Paul, one of the earliest Christ followers, he wrote this. He said, "Once you were dead because of your disobedience and your many sins, but God is so rich in mercy and loved us so much that even though we were dead because of our sins, he gave us life when he raised Christ from the dead. God saved you by his grace when you believed. And you can't take credit for this. It's a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we have done, so none of us can boast about it." In a community, we encourage everyone who's experienced this acceptance we find in Jesus to grow through these practices that sustain us in that grace. And so we celebrate God privately and publicly. We connect with other Christ followers for support and encouragement. And we contribute to the mission of Jesus in significant ways as God uses our time, talents, and resources to achieve his purposes. And that right there, that is what it looks like to live a questionable life. And you can begin that life today. You see, today can be your rebirth day, where you experience God's grace and acceptance simply because you were born. Will you begin to live that questionable life today?